All this digging and planting is pointless work for someone your age, Helen. Karen's voice cut across my garden like a sharp spade. You're 77 years old, not 17. I knelt beside my rose bush, hands deep in rich soil. The same soil I'd tended for 42 years. My old recipe book lay on the garden bench, stained with decades of outdoor cooking and harvest planning. Karen stood on my front walkway, arms crossed, watching me work with the expression of someone witnessing dangerous behavior. You could fall, hurt your back, have a heart attack. I've been gardening longer than you've been alive, I said quietly, continuing to work the earth around my prize roses, the ones that had won county fair ribbons for 15 consecutive years. That's exactly my point, she replied sharply. This kind of physical labor isn't appropriate for someone your age. David agrees with me completely. My son Mark, who used to help me plant tomatoes every spring when he was young, who'd learned about responsibility and patience in these same garden beds. But Mark said nothing to defend me, just stood beside his wife, like a united front against his mother's stubborn independence. I brushed soil from my hands and reached for my recipe book, the weathered pages filled with notes about companion planting and harvest schedule, garden wisdom accumulated over decades. Even this old book is falling apart, Karen observed. Everything about this hobby screams that it's time to find more age-appropriate activities. Age-appropriate activities? As if passion had expiration date, as if knowledge earned through experience should be abandoned for convenience. Silence isn't surrender, it's strength, gathering its breath. My name is Helen. I live in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin. I've been gardening this same plot for 42 years without missing a season. I raised 2 sons and buried a husband, all while keeping this soil productive. Today, my daughter-in-law called my life's passion pointless work for someone my age, while standing in the yard, where I've grown food and beauty for longer than she's been breathing. But what Karen doesn't know is this. My garden holds more than vegetables and flowers. It holds secrets buried deep. That will change everything about her assumption. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own home, you'll understand why this moment stayed with me. This garden on Maple Street has been my sanctuary for 4 decades of marriage and 2 years of widowhood. Every plant tells a story of seasons survived and beauty created. I started this garden when Mark was 2, a young mother wanting to teach my children where food comes from, how patience and care produce abundance from simple seeds. The morning sun still warms my shoulders, the same way it warmed them when I was 35 and strong. The earth still smells rich and promising, full of possibilities for growth. My recipe book chronicles more than recipes. It contains planting schedules and weather patterns, notes about which varieties produced best in our climate, garden wisdom passed down through generations. The yellowed pages record 42 years of successful harvests and failed experiment, of lessons learned through trial and triumph earned through persistence. Some truths arrive quietly but change everything. After Frank died 2 years ago, this garden became even more important, a place where I could feel connected to the cycles of life, where death led to new growth, where hope planted in spring bloomed into beauty by summer. Karen sees only an elderly woman playing in dirt she's too old to handle safely anymore. She doesn't understand that this garden is my meditation, my exercise, my purpose. She wants me to take up safer hobbies, indoor crafts that won't risk injury, activities she considers more suitable for someone approaching 80. Mark inherited his father's gentle nature, but not Frank's understanding of what this garden means to me. He sees potential liability, where Frank saw legacy and love. Karen means well in her practical way. She sees dangers that need eliminating, inefficiencies that require modernizing, but she's never understood that some things can't be measured in safety statistics. My garden isn't just a hobby, or even just a food source. It's proof that I'm still capable of creating something beautiful, of nurturing life from soil. The comments started small, like weeds, that seem harmless until they spread. Karen would mention my dangerous gardening during her weekly safety inspection. All this bending and kneeling can't be good for your joints. Maybe it's time to consider easier ways to enjoy nature. She'd point out potential hazards. These garden tools are so heavy. What if you can't lift them? What if you fall while carrying them? My tools, that I'd used successfully for decades without incident, suddenly transformed into weapons, waiting to injure an unwary elderly woman. Container gardening might be better, she'd suggest. Small pots on a table, where you could sit comfortably, without all this physical strain. Container gardening, reducing 42 years of soil knowledge and plant relationships to a few pots arranged for someone's convenience. Dignity whispers what anger cannot. The real campaign began when she started bringing gardening magazines featuring senior-friendly alternatives. Look at these beautiful raised beds, so much easier on aging backs. She'd flip through pages enthusiastically, showing me simplified gardens designed for people with limitations I didn't actually have. We could hire someone to install these, she'd continue. Make your hobby safer and more manageable for someone your age and physical condition. My physical condition, which included perfect balance, strong muscles from decades of garden work, and flexibility that amazed my doctor during annual checkup. Mark nodded along with her suggestion, not from enthusiasm, but from exhaustion, with a topic that created tension. Every time we gathered as family, a home remembers the hands that built it. Karen began questioning my plant choices. These climbing roses require so much maintenance. Wouldn't simple annuals be easier? Something that doesn't need constant attention and care? My climbing roses, that had been featured in the local garden tour 3 times in the past decade that neighbors stopped to admire during their evening walks. She suggested I simplify my vegetable garden. Do you really need 8 tomato varieties? Wouldn't 1 or 2 be sufficient for someone living alone? 8 varieties, each chosen for specific qualities: early season, late harvest, sauce tomatoes, fresh eating, canning variety. A carefully planned succession that provided fresh tomatoes from June through October. I began to understand then. This wasn't about my safety or physical limitations. This was about her discomfort with activities she couldn't understand or control through modern efficiency. Late spring brought new growth and renewed pressure to abandon what Karen considered dangerous outdoor obsession. Her visits became more focused on documenting safety violations. She'd arrive with her phone camera. Let me just document these uneven pathways in case insurance needs evidence of hazardous conditions, documenting hazards in a garden that had never caused injury to anyone. In 4 decades of family use, pathways worn smooth by decades of careful maintenance, these plant stakes could cause falls, she'd continue, and this compost pile attracts insects and creates odors that can't be healthy for someone with respiratory concerns. Respiratory concerns I didn't have. My doctor had praised my lung capacity just last month, attributing my excellent health to years of outdoor activity. Karen began suggesting alternatives. There are lovely parks nearby where you could enjoy gardens without all the work and responsibility. Much safer for someone your age, enjoying someone else's garden rather than creating my own. Observing rather than participating in the miracle of growing food from carefully tended soil. Some objects hold memories, not value. I started paying closer attention to Karen's real agenda behind this safety campaign. She measured my yard like someone planning major changes. This whole space has so much potential, she'd murmur. With professional landscaping, it could be truly beautiful and completely maintenance-free. Maintenance-free, as if the daily interaction with soil and plants was burden rather than blessing, as if caring for something was problem rather than purpose. My recipe book contained more than garden planning notes. It held family information Karen had never bothered reading: financial records, property details, important dates. That might surprise someone who assumed she knew everything relevant about my situation, including documentation of Frank's wishes about this garden and my right to continue the work. We'd started together 42 years ago. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. Karen thought I was a stubborn elderly woman, clinging to dangerous habits. That put her family at risk of liability and responsibility they didn't want to handle. She had no idea what this garden actually contained beyond vegetables, no understanding of the careful preparations Frank and I had made for exactly this kind of challenge. Some secrets are buried deeper than anyone imagined. Some treasures wait patiently in soil that remembers every hand that worked it with love and purpose. The crisis came on a Tuesday in June. Karen arrived with Mark and a printed list of senior living communities with beautiful garden views. "Mom, we've been discussing your situation," Mark said, his voice gentle but determined. This garden is becoming too much for you to handle safely. Too much to handle? The same garden that had produced prize-winning vegetables just last season, that neighbors praised for its beauty and abundant harvest. We found some lovely places, Karen added, with professional groundskeepers, all the beauty of gardens, without any of the physical demands, professional groundskeepers, instead of my own hands. In soil I'd nurtured for longer than Karen had been alive, viewing gardens through windows, instead of feeling earth between my fingers. What about my plants? I asked. My 42 years of work here? Someone could take over, Mark said. Maybe hire a professional to maintain what's already established. Keep it looking nice for property value. Property value, as if this garden's worth could be measured in dollars rather than decades of love and carefully accumulated knowledge. We're really worried about liability, Karen continued. If you fall or get injured while we're not here to help, the insurance implications alone are frightening to consider. Stories like this remind us that clarity heals more than confrontation. Insurance implications, not my happiness or sense of purpose, but their protection from responsibility they didn't want to shoulder. I've never been injured gardening, I protested. Never had a serious fall or needed emergency assistance in 42 years of working this soil. But that's exactly why. We need to plan ahead, Karen replied. Before something serious happens, while you're still able to make rational decisions, as if wanting to continue. The work that gave my life meaning was somehow irrational, as if passion and purpose had age limits and expiration dates. I looked at my son's face, searching for the boy who'd helped me plant his first tomato, who'd learned responsibility and patience in these same garden beds. That night, I sat in my kitchen, looking out at my garden, in the fading light, seeing 42 years of memories growing in neat rows. Tomorrow I would show them what they'd overlooked in their rush to protect me from my own choices, what this garden really contained, beyond the vegetables and flowers. The next morning brought perfect gardening weather, and Karen's arrival with boxes for packing up anything you want to keep from your garden supplies, packing up, as if the decision had already been made without my actual consent or genuine participation in discussions about my future. We should probably start with the most valuable tools, she said. See what's worth keeping and what should be donated to someone who'll actually use them. Actually use them, as if my daily gardening for 42 consecutive years didn't constitute actual use by someone who understood their value. That's when I decided the time had come. Calm truth cuts deeper than loud accusation. Karen, before we pack anything, I said, I need to show you something in the garden. That might change your perspective. I led her to my rose bed, the prize-winning climber she'd dismissed as too much work for someone my age and limitation. Frank buried something here, I said, kneeling beside the largest bush. 20 years ago, when his heart started giving him warnings about mortality and planning, I began digging carefully around the base of the rose, my hands knowing exactly where to search. In soil I'd worked thousands of times. What kind of something? Karen asked, her curiosity overcoming her impatience. With my stubborn garden attachment, insurance against people who might think they know what's best for me better than I know myself. My fingers found the metal box Frank had buried beneath the roses, wrapped in plastic and preserved against 20 years of weather and seasonal changes. Some distances heal more than apology. Inside the waterproof container lay documents that changed everything about Karen's assumptions and my actual circumstances. Financial records showing investments I'd never mentioned to anyone, property deeds that made clear my complete ownership of house and land, with specific protections against pressure from family members. Frank was a wise man, I said, reading from his letter. He understood that sometimes people mistake age for incompetence, love for the right to control. The documents showed I wasn't a vulnerable widow dependent on family charity, but a woman with resources to hire help when needed, to maintain independence, as long as I chose. But the most important document was Frank's specific instruction about this garden and my right to continue the work we'd started together. He left money specifically for garden maintenance. I continued enough to hire help if I ever needed it, but only if I chose it, not because others decided for me. Karen stared at the papers, understanding dawning about her assumption about my need for their economic and physical support. There's one more thing, I said quietly, pulling out a sealed envelope. Frank's letter about what if family members tried to force me from my home and garden against my will. The letter outlined legal protection Frank had arranged, including lawyers who specialize in elder rights and family pressure, who understood the difference between helping and controlling. Mark arrived as I was reading Frank's words about love and respect and the importance of letting people make their own choices about how to spend their final years. This was all planned? He asked quietly. Your father loved me enough to prepare for possibilities he hoped would never happen, but wanted to prevent, if they ever did. But this wasn't about punishment or embarrassment or revenge. This was about restoration of respect for choices made by someone old enough to understand their own needs. The silence that followed felt different from previous family discussion, this time weighted with respect rather than assumptions, with understanding rather than fear-based decision-making. Karen spoke first, her voice uncertain. Helen, I had no idea about any of this preparation. I thought you were struggling, both financially and physically. I never said I was struggling, I replied gently. You assumed I was, based on what seemed reasonable for someone my age, living alone. Mark looked at the document, understanding finally dawning about his father's foresight and his mother's actual situation. Dad planned for this, he said quietly. He knew we might not understand how important this garden is to your happiness. Your father understood something crucial, I said. That taking care of someone doesn't mean taking away everything that gives their life meaning. That love should support choices, not eliminate them. We spent the next hour talking honestly about assumptions and reality, about the difference between helping and controlling someone you care about. Karen apologized for her pressure about abandoning my garden, for assuming I needed protection from activities I'd managed successfully for over 4 decades. I was projecting my own fears, she admitted, about what might happen if I couldn't garden anymore, how I'd feel losing something that important to me. Some objects hold memories, not value. We talked about going forward differently, about asking instead of assuming, about trusting my assessment of my own capabilities until evidence suggested otherwise. I want to understand better, Karen said. Would you teach me about your garden? Help me learn what makes each plant special to you? And I want to help, Mark added, the way I used to when I was young, and understood that working together was better than taking over. The metal box went back, under the roses, where Frank had placed it, with love and wisdom about protecting what matters most. Over the following months, our relationships bloomed, like well-tended garden. Karen started visiting to learn, rather than to criticize, about companion planting and soil preparation. Mark brought his children regularly to learn about patience and growth. In the garden where he'd learned the same lessons decades earlier. Grandma's garden is like magic, my granddaughter said. She plants tiny seeds and grows huge tomatoes. It's like she has superpowers. Christmas that year felt like harvest celebration. Karen brought me rare seeds for next year's garden. I found them at the specialty shop downtown. Mark's gift was a new garden journal for recording all your wisdom, so we don't lose the knowledge you've accumulated over the years. If this story touched something familiar, may your next chapter be softer than the last. I learned important lessons about passion and family dynamics, about the value of preparation when people mistake age for inability, wisdom for stubbornness. Your interests matter, no matter your age. Your knowledge has value. Your right to continue activities that bring joy and purpose should be protected and respected. Real love supports different definitions of appropriate aging. Real care offers assistance without demanding surrender. Real protection builds understanding rather than eliminating choices. Age brings experience, not automatic limitation. Gray hair represents accumulated knowledge, not diminished capacity. And sometimes the most beautiful gardens are tended by hands that have learned through decades of patient practice. The recipe book still sits on my garden bench, stained with soil and weather, but filled with wisdom about growing things that matter in soil that remembers every season of care.